Have you ever been put in a situation where you had to stand up for God in a crowd, perhaps not a crowd that was particularly friendly? Today, we're going to be talking about a circumstance just like that. It's a famous story out of the book of Daniel. We're in the third chapter of Daniel, and every Sunday school, you've heard this, probably the first or second most popular story in the book of Daniel next to the lion's den. And we're going to talk about how this Sunday school story applies to you and me in today's world. And we'll do that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead, and Kyle and I are going to continue our study in the book of Daniel. Today, we're going to be talking in the third chapter, and this is probably the most familiar story in the book of Daniel to us. But I want us to see what it says and how we can think about it as it applies to today. And we're going to be thinking of application and asking ourselves some interesting questions as we go here. Are you ready to get started, Kyle?
I'm ready.
Well, listen, guys, this is a real Bible study. This is a Bible study between friends. There's no rehearsal, there's no script. This is just two friends getting together to study the Word. And we're inviting you to sit in and join us. And we hope it's a blessing to you. And if it is, we'd ask you to like it, subscribe. I'd love to hear your comments, and we will respond to those as quickly as we possibly can. All right, let's get into the scriptures here, Kyle. And why don't you start out by reading to us the first 5 verses? And let's look at these verses together, and we can move through this section pretty quickly.
All right. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon.
Okay, now wait a second. What's a cubit?
Is it like an arm length or something? Or
Okay, typically it's the length from the tip of your fingers to your elbow. It's about 18 inches.
okay,
That was a biblical cubit. So when it says, let's say 60 cubits
60, yeah.
by 6 cubits, if you multiply that times 18 inches and then do the math, it's the dimensions of this statue is 90 feet by 9 feet. All right. Now, there's a lot of illustrations that I've seen here, this story where this is a statue of Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, I even had some commentaries say, this is the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. And it's nowhere does it say it's a statue of him.
Yeah.
This is a statue that he has put up, but nowhere does it say it's a statue of him. So there again, we're paying attention to what it actually says and not maybe what we've seen in illustrations or something. And this dimension of 90 feet by 9 feet, this is really not a proportion that would be the proportion of a man, like his dream was of a man.
Oh, interesting.
This is a gold statue, and it's probably describing an obelisk similar to what we see in Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar had probably seen obelisks on the border of Egypt, these tall, thin pillars, basically, that proclaim the kingdom, and it's not necessarily to a god. In fact, it never says this is to a god or the statue of a god or the statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself. So I just want to clarify that as we go here. When we come across this like description of cubits, stop and think for a minute what that really looks like. It's 90 feet high by 9 feet wide. So it's this thin little needle that goes up into the air almost 100 feet. All right. Sorry to interrupt you there. Let's go back. Go ahead and pick up at verse 2.
Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the councils, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up."
Okay, so what do you see here in these verses that pretty typical introduction to the story, but what do we see?
Yeah, I thought what stood out to me was just the number of job titles, so to speak, that he invites to this. It
Okay.
seems like it covers all the bases, all the important people, really in the whole kingdom. It seems like.
Yeah, what I did was I stopped and in my notes I took a number and say, okay, when it said satrap, what is that, and what is the judge, and what is magistrates, and what are these things? Basically, what it's talking about is, like you said, this covers all of the elements from just representatives of the king down to the police department, the military, the civil lawgivers. So this really represented the entire administration of the kingdom. As Nebuchadnezzar ruled this huge Babylonian empire, there were regional representatives, the regional governors, we would say. They're not kings in the sense of Nebuchadnezzar, but they are rulers of that area. So this group in front of the statue is basically every official in the government. Now it's an interesting thing here that we don't think Daniel is in this group. He's somewhere else. He's off doing something, but he's not included in this group, and we'll see why later. But as a high official, probably second in the kingdom, he is not included in this group that's called together. And they have this fantastic image in front of them and a band that really creates some music. And the band is made up of, there's a big list, and it's made up of wind instruments and stringed instruments that are there to create an atmosphere of awe. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's also interesting. I think when I've thought of this story before, I picture that it's the whole kingdom that's got, he expects all the people in the whole kingdom to bow down, but it's interesting that
It's
it does
really
seem,
not.
it seems like it's just the important people.
This is not talking about all the public, all
Yeah.
the people in the kingdom. There is something administrative about this. There's something, and that's why a lot of scholars that I did this research said that this obelisk that was up was a representation of his kingdom, the authority of his kingdom, not him, but the idea of worshiping the state. Okay, worshiping the authority of the kingdom. So this is kingdom officials, not the public. And this is not worshiping of a god. This is worshiping the state and the authority of the state. And basically Nebuchadnezzar, I remember, he's fairly new in his kingdom. He's probably by now, he's probably 3 years into his reign. And he's really interested in establishing the rule of the kingdom and the authority of the kingdom. And he just got his idea from this dream that he had where
Yeah.
his kingdom was the head of gold. So he says, I want my kingdom to be represented by this gold statue. And he calls together all of his officials in the government to give homage to the kingdom and his authority.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
It does. Yeah.
And so we never see that the statue is of him or the statue is of a god. That's the statue is a statue representing the kingdom. And all of these officials are there to do homage to the kingdom. It would be like people who worship the Declaration of Independence or even the Constitution more than they worship God, where the authority of our country isn't higher than our loyalty to God Himself. So that's this, it's worship of the state here. It's a political thing. Now, let's read forward to about verse 10. Now, what we
Okay.
see, and I off to my left, I've given headings because now we see the threat, and then we see the pressure, and then we see the hate. So let's look down through this story and see that as they jump out. And underlined this phrase, a furnace of blazing fire. In fact, I called this Bible study Standing in the Fire. And we'll talk more about that, of how we stand in the fire. But let's go into this, the threat, the pressure, and the hate. Read from verse 6 down to verse 10.
Okay. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, is to fall down and worship the golden image.
Okay, let's stop there and go. Now, if we go back and look at this, is the first time we hear about the furnace, and this is basically these giant smelting furnaces that they had to smelt down ore, like iron and those kinds of things. And the threat is, I'm going to have you worship the state. And if you don't, there's this blazing fire. It's going to cost you. And you're going to be put into the midst of this burning fire, right? Now, the pressure was all the people, it's a couple of times, everybody assembled. Okay. So you see, the threat is, if you don't, you're going to be cast into this fire. Everybody there is going to bow down and worship. So there's this peer pressure that is there saying everybody else is doing it and everybody else is following this command, and with this music and this atmosphere that's created. And there's this pressure, go along.
You're going to stand out if you don't.
Yeah. So everybody there, now this isn't all the people of the nation. That'd be this huge crowd, but it's a pretty good sized crowd of government officials, and everybody's going to do it. So there's a pressure there that we experience today in our culture. That's just a peer pressure that we hear at school or at work in different places. Now, the next heading we get is the hate. And that's this circumstances where there's an accusation brought to the Jews down in verse 8 and 9. In fact, read verse 8 again. It's very interesting.
At this time, some astrologers came forward and maliciously accused the Jews.
Okay. The astrologers, these are the Chaldeans. They were in last week too. But all of a sudden, there's some Chaldeans who come, and who do they accuse?
The Jews.
Now, it's interesting. They don't accuse Daniel. They accuse the Jews. This is a broad thing, and they're going to specifically accuse Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that these three, and they don't include their friend Daniel. Apparently, Daniel is not there, because nowhere in this section, when the king is starting to say, if you don't bow down, I'm going to burn you, is Daniel there saying, "Oh, king, remember my God, the God of the dream." There's no intercession by Daniel. So every scholar I looked at said Daniel is probably off on some kind of business and not present in this situation. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are on their own.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And it just doesn't say anything about Daniel. It says, I'm going to accuse the Jews and I'm going to accuse these three people, but not including Daniel, because Daniel may have been too high to really touch. Okay.
It's
So
also interesting that if you think about the fact that even I think earlier in chapter 1, it talked about it wasn't just those four guys. There were other Jews as well.
sure.
But it almost seems to insinuate that those other guys probably just went along with everyone else.
That's right. The provincial governors would have included the king from Israel that they left there to rule in Babylon's name. And it doesn't say any of the other Jews had any problem with just going along with it.
Yeah.
So you might be in a situation where you're asked to go along, and maybe even other people that call themselves Christians go along, but there's some pressure on you to go along and you've got to make a decision. And let's go and let's look at that together here. In 10, these accusers say, oh, you've made this decree. Every man who hears the sound of all this music needs to fall down and worship the golden image. Again, it doesn't say a god. It doesn't say got to fall down and worship you. It just says they have to fall down and worship this image, this representation of the kingdom.
Yeah.
Now, verse 11 says, but whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of the burning of a blazing fire. And that's this term that's used over and over again. We're going to see that. So there's this hatred we see, even amongst the Chaldeans that Daniel just got done saving their lives.
Yeah.
There's still people that are anti-Semitic. There are still haters that hate the Jews just because they're Jews. These aren't other Jews. These are just Gentiles who don't like the Jews. And probably one of the reasons why they don't like the Jews, especially these three, is slaves are supposed to come in and be second-class citizens. They're not supposed to come in and immediately get into the ruling class. And Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego had become rulers, government officials. And that creates some envy and some hatred. So it goes in specifically, the hate is shown in verse 12. The appointed over administration, these Jews whom you have appointed over the administration. So there's a kind of an accusation there, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image. That again, it doesn't say they don't serve your gods and worship your gods. It says they don't serve your gods and worship the golden image which you have set up. Now, that goes to the stand. We start to see this where Nebuchadnezzar flies into a rage because he hears that even some of his own government officials are not responding to this, showing awe and even worship for the state. Pick up in verse 13 down to 15.
Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?
Now, I want us to pay attention to that question. What does he say at the end of verse 15?
What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?
The state, you're going to be in the hands of the state and in my hands as king, and nobody is going to be able to deliver you out of my hands, right? Now we pick up and continue on, and we're going to probably stop here in a second because I want to really dwell on this for a minute. So we're not going to finish this chapter. Verse 16 is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. Now, the answer is to the question he just asked. What God is there that can deliver you out of my hands? And they said, we don't need to give you an answer. But if it be so, our God, here's the answer. What God? Nebuchadnezzar says, what God can deliver you? And they said, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hands. But if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Now, I want to stop here for a moment. This is typical of the places we find ourselves very often in our businesses, in our jobs, in our families, in our culture. We're hanging out with friends, and all of a sudden, there's this kind of threat that, hey, if you're part of us, if you're going to be with us, you need to do this. And it's not a good thing. And we have to make a decision to stand. And I love what they say in response to the king. And I stopped and did a study, and I want to just show you this. In fact, you can, when you're looking at the video here, you can stop and read these verses over here on the left. But I asked myself the question, how great is my God? Do I believe that my God is able? You see what they said? Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us. And so I asked myself the question, and there's some great verses in there that God is able to save us. He's able to give us grace. He's able to make us strong. He's able to help us stand. He is able. And I went off on a little bit of a Bible study asking myself, is my God able to deliver me? And then they say something very interesting. What's their next comment?
But even if he does not, let it be known to you that we will not serve.
So they're saying God could do a miracle here and save us.
Yeah.
But even if he doesn't, we're still not going to worship this thing. Look up Job chapter 13, verse 15. And we see Job with this same sentiment here.
Though he slay me, I will find hope in him. I will still defend my ways to his face.
So you have here, their stand is, oh, great king, we're not going to worship this. And you ask the question, what God can deliver you? Our God, who we serve, is able to deliver us. But even if he doesn't and we die, we still will not worship this image. We're going to worship God. And
Yeah.
Job said, even if it costs me my life, I will serve him.
It's
So
great.
let's stop here and think of an example, a real world example. Can you think of any time that you've experienced this same kind of thing where there's a threat, there's pressure to follow along, and you've got to take a stand and give a testimony? And that's what they did. Our God is able to deliver us, but
Yeah.
even if he doesn't, we're not going to go down this path with you. Can you think of
Yeah.
any time in your life that maybe this has happened?
Yeah. I think of being in college, living in a dorm, lots of some Christian friends, but mostly non-Christian, and just being willing to take a stand against immorality and people, probing you. Why aren't you following along? Why aren't you doing
Yeah.
this stuff with us? And
And you hear comments like, "Oh, come on, Kyle, be cool. Come on, be cool. Don't be a prude." Right?
yeah,
I remember one time I was traveling. I had been invited to travel with the top 20 executives in my company who were the top executives, CEO, the president, the marketing director, the operations director. And I'd been asked to travel with them in this luxury bus. And we were going around, we had 120 locations, and we were going to go in this luxury bus. And I was excited to be there with all these executives because I was middle management. And all of a sudden we decided that it was time for lunch. And where do you want to go to lunch? And one of the guys said, "Oh, I know this great place, got a great buffet lunch. It's a strip joint just down the road. And they have shows going on during lunch, and they put on a buffet to get people to come in at lunchtime to these strip shows." And everybody was going, "Hey, yeah, that'd be a good idea. We'll go there." And I'm sitting there and going, this is not a place I want to go. So I was very quietly, I didn't say up, I'm a Christian and I'm not going to go. I just said, guys, just going to stay in the bus and work while you guys go in. It's okay. I'm not that hungry and I'll be okay. I'm just going to stay in the bus and work. And the CEO just all of a sudden it hit him that maybe this wasn't a good business environment to go to. And we went somewhere else and nobody gave me a hard time. But saying, I'll just stay in the bus and I'm not going to be included in this high level lunch meeting, that could have cost me. And not going along in college with your friends could cost you. It may not kill you, but there may be a circumstances where it would at least kill you spiritually. And so what we see here is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego giving a testimony. The testimony is, my God is able to deliver me, but even if he doesn't, and even if it costs me, I'm going to stand for him. And let's close there, Kyle. Any thoughts that you have on the same kind of issue that we face?
Oh, yeah, I think it's important. I think that especially as more and more pressure is getting applied in the corporate world for even thinking of like LGBT issues. And
Yeah,
so I think it's a pretty relevant, these cultural things that kind of deep into business and might be forced down. There might be consequences for some of it. And
yeah, I was listening to a message from a pastor who was invited to go to a government council, and a guy got up and he was talking about the inclusiveness and how we need to be inclusive, and shouldn't we all get up and just encourage each other and help each other and respect the beliefs of others. In fact, just incorporate them into our beliefs, and isn't this a good idea? And he said, in fact, if you think that's a good idea, why don't you just stand with me? And tons of people in the room stood up as this kind of social thing to do. And the pastor and a number of Christians at his table couldn't stand. They just couldn't. And they had some look like, oh, come on. That's what in your dorm where they say, come on, be cool. Don't be such a nasty person, right? But we got to stand. And God is able to give us blessings in those situations. And even if he doesn't, he is able, but he may decide not to. And it might cost us. And we got to be willing to stand and give a testimony for our faith. Amen?
Amen. That's great application.
So this isn't just a Sunday school story about if I'm ever asked to worship a golden statue, I'm not going to. No, this is really about peer pressure that has some kind of a threat attached to it where we're asked to compromise what we believe and go along with something that is not edifying to God. And that lesson we can take home. And I hope it's a lesson that is a blessing to you guys on YouTube and that it has made you think. Next week, we're going to finish this chapter and look at this fantastic miracle. This isn't just a Sunday school miracle. This is a miracle we can look into, dissect what really happens, and see God's hand at work. Too often when we're talking about, I'm going to have faith in a situation, we wait and see if God does a miracle or if God provides, and then we'll say, okay, we'll believe him if he provides. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego really say, he is able to provide, but even if he doesn't, we're going to believe in him. And that's a different aspect that many of us don't bring to our everyday faith and our everyday stand and our everyday testimony about the Lord. But today we've been talking about standing up for God, the circumstances, the threats of our culture that want us to just go along and not stand for God in the midst of the fire. I'd like to recommend a video to you. It's called Remembering God's Character in Hard Times. It's out of the book of Habakkuk, and I think you'll enjoy it. And we're going to continue our study in Daniel next week. And until then, God bless you.